Well, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. I'm looking forward to having the opportunity to kind of kick things off by getting some of the big ideas out here, some of the big issues. We're going to go a little quickly through this, but with the hope that in covering this kind of at a higher level, you're going to be able to think about some of these and over the course of the next couple days in this meeting, and then really start to think about how they apply to you as well. Getting beyond the rhetoric, bringing our students to real college readiness. I've been working in this area since the early 1990s and intensively since around the year 2000, and have done a tremendous amount of research over that period of time, and I've tried to summarize that in the 3 volumes that you see listed here. The one on the right will be coming out in October. So much of what I say is contained in the books, and particularly in the book Getting Ready for College Careers in the Common Core, what every educator needs to know, has a lot of these points in a lot more detail. So if you're interested in following up on some of this, you can take a look at that. Well, just to start this off, let's remember that high school diploma is really not enough of a target in today's and tomorrow's economy, particularly if you're focusing on high school graduation as a key. It's really got to go beyond that. And if you take a look at what's happened, this is from over the period of the recession and then the recovery. You can see that people with a college level education, that in fact there was 187,000 jobs created during the recession and 2 million jobs during the recovery. For people with associate's degree, you can see that they lost about 1.75 million jobs, and now they've gained about 1.65 million. But for people with a high school diploma or less, they lost about 5.6 million jobs, and now have lost an additional 230,000 jobs. Very sobering statistics, and worth keeping in mind that a high school diploma will simply not be a sufficiently high level of challenge and achievement in the future, and that if we focus state policy just on the diploma, we will never really get students to the level they need, which is learning beyond high school. So let me just quickly go over the topics that we'll be talking about today. I want to share my definition of college and career ready with you very quickly. Introduce a model that I've worked on for a number of years, the 4 keys to college and career readiness. Deeper learning, introduce it as a concept so that you can really think about how deeper learning connects with college and career readiness. And then how do we move students from being novices to being experts, which is really a key in getting students ready for college. And then finally, what are some actions you can consider? Well, what's my definition of college and career ready? You've probably seen a lot of definitions floating around. Some of your states may have a definition. My definition is a student who possesses the content knowledge, strategies, skills, and techniques necessary to be successful in a post-secondary setting. That's the first part of the definition. The middle part, not every student needs exactly the same knowledge and skills to be college and career ready. Now that's an important distinction from many definitions. And then finally, a student's college and career interests help identify the precise knowledge and skills students need. Now how is this different from what other people have come up with as definitions, and even some of my own earlier work in this area? This one encompasses a wide range of post-secondary options. We really cannot be successful if we focus all kids on just 4-year baccalaureate degrees. We've got to have an inclusive definition of college and career readiness that includes a wide range of post-secondary programs. We've got to focus on more than a lack of remediation. Many of the definitions, including one I offered earlier, identifies readiness as the lack of remediation. If you're not remedial, you're ready. Well, it's really more than that, and I'm going to try to show you what the additional aspects of it are. This definition acknowledges the reality that different programs of study can require different knowledge and skill levels. And I think most of us kind of know this intuitively, that if you're going into a program to be a pharmacy technician or a heating, ventilation, air conditioning service person, that you need a different type of math and English background than if you're going into medical record technology or if you're going into a baccalaureate program. There's different profiles. There's a set of foundational knowledge and skills, and then there are different profiles of specific content prerequisites that students need to know. And we haven't really acknowledged that in our thinking yet of readiness. We want to validate students' interests and goals as reference points for readiness. Right now, we're not thinking enough about linking students' aspirations with any type of a determination of how ready they are. And we can see that if we don't think about readiness in relationship to goals, we can inaccurately decide that students aren't ready when in fact they could be ready to go on to college, or conversely, we can decide someone's ready when in fact they aren't based on their goals. So knowing more about the goals students have, getting students to develop their interests and goals earlier, critically important. And this definition puts students at the center. Now clearly you have to translate this into policies for accountability systems, for admissions requirements, for placement and so forth. But if we start with the student at the center and we think about readiness from the student's point of view and generate the information we need from that to get to the point where we can create state-level complementary systems, we're better than what we tend to do, which is the opposite, which is to say, what information can we generate at the state level, and then how can we use that to determine readiness, and then, oh, by the way, it trickles down to the individual student, and there's some issues with that I'll try to share. The model that I've come up with by analyzing literally thousands of entry-level college courses, working with post-secondary instructors, conducting multiple studies for a variety of different states and entities and agencies, is this model. And some of you have perhaps been introduced to it previously. We've been evolving it a little bit, and I just want to share where it is currently. The idea is there are 4 keys to college and career readiness. One is the ability to think, what I call key cognitive strategies, the content that people know, the ability then to act through the use of key learning skills and techniques, and then the ability actually to go to college by mastering key transition knowledge and skills. And I'll touch on each of these very quickly. But here's the details of the model. And this is going to be a lot of information, and I don't expect you to digest it all, but I just want you to see that, that when we think about key cognitive strategies, I'll mention these again in just a moment, but there's basically 10 key cognitive strategies. And the content knowledge, I'm willing to accept the Common Core state standards in terms of the specifications of the knowledge itself, or other states have very high quality standards. Virginia, Texas, Alaska, and others that aren't in the Common Core, Nebraska, have very high quality standards as well. So we can use the state standards to reference the content knowledge. But what we're missing is students' attitude toward the content knowledge and their understanding of the structure of knowledge. And we'll get to that when we talk about deeper learning. The learning skills and techniques, the act part, includes one I think is the overlooked and most important variable, which is ownership of learning. Getting students to take some responsibility and ownership of their own learning. Now, I'm not trying to blame the victim at all. I'm trying to say that the kind of learning we want students to do is contingent upon them engaging deeply and processing information and making connections to their future and their interests. And they need a set of learning techniques. Learning is a process that requires a lot of skill. And some students are getting those techniques, either at school or at home or in other experiences they have. And other students, when we're inadvertently focusing so much on basic skills that we don't get these students the learning techniques and skills that they need. And then finally, the key transition knowledge and skills includes knowing the context of how to apply, understanding the procedures involved in doing that, and understanding the types of institutions that are open to you, knowing the financial implications of it, the cultural dimensions of college as a different experience than high school, and then the personal issues of being able to advocate for yourself in college, connect with others, relate to a college professor, and so forth. So these 4 keys define the universe of variables that we have identified that if students can do these things, they are much more likely to be ready to succeed in college. Let's go over them briefly then. So the key cognitive strategies, what is a strategy? It's a systematic approach and a plan of action. So thinking strategically, one plans out what one's going to do and then executes that plan, as opposed to sort of trial and error or just randomly going about something or just following directions. So these are the strategies, and this is sort of a discussion in and of them itself. When we work with teachers, it's a lot of fun to go through these in a lot of detail. I don't have the time right now except to say that you'll notice the first one, if we start here, is problem formulation. It's not problem solving. It's because young people very often are given the problem and just asked to solve it, but in the real world, that almost never happens. You have to start by formulating the problem. Figuring out what the problem is very often is a large proportion of solving it properly. And in this model, you have to be able to hypothesize and strategize. Then you conduct research to collect information. You interpret what you found. You analyze and evaluate it. Then you communicate what you found by organizing and constructing a response in any of a variety of structures and media. And you do all this with precision and accuracy to monitor and confirm your findings. Now, this is also known as kind of the inquiry cycle. This is very much a part of what is involved in the actively engaged elements of post-secondary learning. Now, certainly there's a lot of post-secondary learning that involves transmitting content knowledge, but the processing of it involves these types of skills. And increasingly in the work world, many of these cognitive strategies become increasingly important as young people are asked to work as members of teams, are given problems to solve in the workplace, and not just procedures to follow. Have any of you ever tried to assemble something that you bought online or at IKEA or somewhere else? There's a lot of laughing going on because you know that for you this is a very strategic process. You have to think about the strategies that you're going to use to do this. And if we had a little more time, probably I'd ask you some of those strategies. But I'll give you examples of the kind of things that people commonly describe as a strategy that they would use as an adult. A few people would read the directions, but not that many. Some people would go onto YouTube and actually find a video that somebody else has put up there for whatever reason. I mean, can't imagine why, but somebody shows you how to assemble a bookcase from IKEA, and they put a video up online. It's a new world. Other people would take a look at the picture. Some people would lay all the parts and pieces out in a very orderly fashion. I'm asking you to all think about which of these apply to you, because I know that there's a variety of these that apply to you or that won't. Some people are just the trial and error types. They'll just put it together, and when it's done, there's a few pieces left over, and they just hope they're not important. And finally, there's the people who just hire somebody else to do it. So that's, as adults, we have that range of strategies available. Now, the other question I'd ask is, have you ever watched somebody else try to put something like this together when they were using an ineffective strategy? What was the effect of that, and how interested, by the way, were they in having you tell them what they were doing wrong? So think about it. As adults, we have control over a lot of these variables. But as our young people, when they come into school without a range of cognitive strategies, without a range of learning skills and techniques, they have one way of doing it, and that's the way that the teacher tells them, or the way that the assignment is set up. If they can't do it that one way, what do? They become like that person who's trying to put together this without using the correct strategy. They get frustrated, they stop. There's a whole series of behaviors to avoid having to look like they don't know what they're doing, or to deal with the frustration that they've experienced. So getting students a range of cognitive strategies and learning skills is extremely important if we're going to give them more difficult tasks that cannot be completed just by following directions. So let's stay in this same theme here, talk a little bit about the content knowledge. I'm not going to go into a lot of depth, except to say that so much of the teaching that occurs does not really get to the deeper cognitive levels, and students never get the structure of knowledge. The content they learn as individual parts and pieces, and I really worry about test prep as a teaching strategy, because it goes against the notion of students understanding the structure of knowledge, which is one of the insights we get from brain and cognitive sciences and from experimental psychology on learning, is that human beings need to make meaning, make sense out of the information and organize it into structures. And finally, what's the relationship to content? Interesting thing to talk about. In the US, we've believed in aptitude-based models, meaning people were good at something or not good at it. And matter of fact, the SAT was designed as an aptitude test originally. It was going to find the bright people who were out there, regardless of the school they went to. We're increasingly moving to an effort-based model. A competency model is based on the notion that pretty much everybody can do it if they work hard enough and try. So moving from aptitude-based explanations of success to effort-based explanations of success is one of those important transitions that needs to occur if we're going to really have students engage and be successful and expect most students to go on to college. Do you remember that we used to believe that most students couldn't really succeed in college? That when we admitted students to college, and some of you may sort of recall this, you didn't get a letter that said, congratulations, we've determined you're fully prepared to succeed at our college. You got a letter that was kind of the equivalent to the parking permit that I get at the University of Oregon. It does not guarantee me a parking space. It guarantees me the right to drive around and see if I can find one. And we're admitting students to college with that same sort of a notion when we use an aptitude model, which is we say, well, we don't know if you can make it or not, so we'll use entry-level courses as the real admissions process. We'll see if you can pass those courses. Well, that's an aptitude-based kind of a model. An effort-based model really says the system is going to be set up that if you work hard, if you know what is expected of you, and if you can demonstrate it in ways that we've specified, then you will be able to succeed. So moving from aptitude to effort-based notions of content mastery is really important. Well, here's just an example of how this plays out. We have a tool called Campus Ready that we use to determine what's going on in schools relative to perceptions of college readiness by students and teachers. And this is what we found out when we asked about content knowledge challenge level at 4 high schools in the same school district. Nearly every high school teacher in the district reports that they're able to challenge most of my students, sometimes often, or very often. That shouldn't surprise you too much. But when you ask the students, what do you get? 50 to 65% of the students report being challenged sometimes, rarely, or never. And sometimes I'll ask you in the audience, if those of you who have children or who have grown children, did you ever ask your kids what they did in school when they came home from school? Did anybody ever ask their kids that? And what was the answer that you got every single time? They all did nothing. And then if you asked them if they had any homework, what was the answer you got from that? No, so they did nothing, they had no homework. It's an amazing thing to consider when we know that a lot more than that was going on. So we've got a real mismatch in perception on challenge, and I think there's an opportunity to challenge students at a higher level than we do now. Well, the third of the four keys is those learning skills and techniques, the ownership of learning, and then those particular skills. And those, I argue, are incredibly important and underdeveloped currently. Here's the kind of things that students need to be able to do. They have to know themselves and become self-aware, explore interests, passions, skills, and ambitions. They have to set goals and know how to achieve those goals. They have to be motivated and have the mindset then to use their motivation in relation to their goals. They have to persist and not give up, particularly when they're dealing with something that doesn't come easily. They have to monitor their own performance in a lot more depth and really know how well they can do something, not just the grade they got, because grades have really inflated dramatically and they're not that good of a measure anymore of a student's actual performance level. And they need to know how to ask for help, and interestingly enough, and paradoxically, the students who need help the most are the least likely to ask for it. And finally, they've got to demonstrate self-efficacy, know how to take control of things in their own lives. Now you can look at this and say, well, this is also kind of a recipe for maturity. But these things can be taught. We can help students to develop them. And when we don't develop these things in young people, they end up sort of carrying a lack of maturity into their 20s. And how many of you have read the statistics on the number of the job churn that goes on for young people when they go from one position to another? They'll go from 5 to 7 jobs in their early 20s. And they're not on a career path. They're just bouncing around. One of the reasons why, they haven't developed these types of skills and capabilities. If you put them together into a model of ownership of learning, you can see the component parts that you have here. If we can get motivation and engagement, then that leads to goal orientation and self-direction, which then leads to a sense of self-efficacy and self-confidence, which then triggers metacognition and self-monitoring, and then which leads to greater persistence and resilience, and around we go. These are the kinds of things where we need to talk to students about these, the importance of these skills, and we need to build them. Even something like persistence, getting students to work on assignments they can't complete in one period, getting students to deal with frustrations, math problems that they can't answer in 3 to 5 minutes. We have plenty of information that suggests, and evidence that suggests students don't persist with difficult tasks. So all of these skills need to be developed. And how many of these do we measure currently? And I'm going to come back to that point in a moment. So on the learning skills, these are the types of things: manage your time, take notes, study for tests, memorize, read strategically, learn collaboratively, and use technology. Some students learn to do these, other students don't. If we talk about an achievement gap, we tend to focus on math and English scores, and yet we have a bigger gap in learning skills and techniques. And it's amazing to me that we think that our low-achieving students are somehow going to master math and English without us ever giving them any more tools to learn the content. Sort of just a very quick story. I was an assistant superintendent in Fort Collins, Colorado. I was in charge of summer school as one of my responsibilities. In the first year I was there, I decided I'd go to the summer school and see how it was working. And lo and behold, we took all the kids in the district who'd flunked a particular course. We put them all together in one classroom in one high school and gave them, which is not a good idea. And then we gave them the same book that they'd had during the year, gave them a teacher who was a good teacher, but I'm certain had other things that she wanted to be doing. And then, oh, by the way, to save a few bucks, we did not air condition the room. So why did we expect that these students were going to get this content the second time when we didn't equip them in any way to learn it beyond what they'd done the first time? The learning skills and techniques are critical, underdeveloped, and underassessed. Finally, the transition knowledge and skills. The U.S. may not be #1 on TIMSS and PISA, but when it comes to the complexity of making the transition from high school to college, I would submit to you we are #1 in the world. And we have created systems because we like local control and we like a lot of different types of institutions being in charge of their own standards and their own requirements. And as a result, getting our young people to apply to college, know the requirements, submit the right forms, get the financial aid information, deal with the FAFSA, which, oh, by the way, I've never found in another country, is a really complex process. And those of you who deal with young people in one capacity or another know that a lot of times you have to kind of chase them down the hallway the day before these forms are due to get them to submit them and get all of this taken care of. Think about the families where the young people do not have that kind of help and support. We've created a built-in structural disadvantage for entire groups of young people who just don't have access to the privileged knowledge that many of our children have. So we've created a system that has roadblocks built right in. Therefore, we have to teach these things in school. We just have to make them transparent, provide this information, make it public, help them to master it. We could also simplify the system, which would not be a bad idea either. So how do we assess these 4 keys? The cognitive strategies, the content knowledge, the learning skills and techniques, the key transition knowledge and skills. Well, if you think about it, the fully college and career-ready student is the one who has mastered all of these. Right now, we intensively measure the content knowledge, and you notice that dotted line. We do some measure of the cognitive strategies to the degree to which they overlap the content knowledge. But we do not measure the key learning skills and techniques or the key transition knowledge and skills. So what are some of the implications then of these 4 keys? Readiness is complex and multidimensional. Students need to begin developing readiness early, really 6th grade, around 6th grade. Elementary school, we could talk, there's a lot that can be done, particularly around building vocabulary skills and introducing academic vocabulary, really critically important, building mathematics skills. But middle school on is when we have to start sharing the privileged knowledge. We have to start exploring interests in a much more serious fashion. I don't mean tracking students, I mean showing them what's possible and having them get a link between those interests and the academic learning that they're engaging in. We've got to give them college-like experiences, expose them to colleges. But that has to start a lot younger. Parents have to be given information a lot earlier as well. We can't just have one parent night in the junior year where the parents show up and find out they don't have enough money to send their kid to college. I mean, we need to introduce the information so they can find out early that they don't have enough money to send their kid to college. But there are ways that we can deal with that, and there are strategies that people can use if we can get to them early enough. Content knowledge needs to be deepened through the use of cognitive strategies. I'm going to say it again. Test prep just doesn't work. The research on it's entirely clear. It's a diminishing returns line. You get you actually get a small bump, and then the more you do it, the less of a return you get. It actually goes down. Students don't retain it. They don't know the information. And lo and behold, the next year, you're right back to the same problem again because the students didn't retain anything from the first year. If the Common Core state standards, in fact, are fewer, and that they do allow us to go deeper, then we really need to use this opportunity to have students gain a much deeper understanding of the content because they'll retain it better and they'll be able to perform better on tests that, particularly if the consortia assessments are more complex, which they appear to be, students will perform better as a result. Learning strategies and techniques are not explicitly taught or measured in most cases. They can be. They shouldn't be high stakes. We shouldn't compare them to content-based achievement tests or standards-based tests, but we should be gathering information about things like time management of students and their goal setting and their persistence, and giving that information as feedback to the students so that it's actionable. They can do something about it. All students, but particularly first-generation students, are going to need a lot of help with the college transition process, a point that I made previously. I mentioned developmental education because in a lot of states there's a real focus on remediation and eliminating remediation, which I think is a noble goal. But we need to rethink it a little bit because even though deficiencies in English language, arts, and math are important to recognize, students' strengths are also important to identify. We're not doing a very good job of identifying their strengths. We're focusing most of our attention on their weaknesses. And if we want a broader range of students to go on to college, we've got to find the strengths as well as the weaknesses, which also requires some additional measures that beyond just a placement test. Readiness is going to hinge on a program that a student plans to pursue, and that's a point I made a little earlier. We've done research on this with the College Board. We've also done research on this with the National Assessment Governing Board. And Mark Tucker and National Center on Education and the Economy released a report about a month ago. We're getting the basis now for a research base and a knowledge base that says there's differences among programs, particularly certificate level programs and associate's degree level programs, that really strongly suggest that we need to be coming up with a variety of measures and different types of profiles of readiness for different post-secondary programs of study. Students need to learn the specific content knowledge and learning skills necessary for readiness in their program. We have to tailor things a little bit more for students so that we can get more students to that readiness level. So now moving on to the deeper learning notion here, I just want to cover this, introduce this because I've said how important it is that we understand deeper learning. So a short definition, it results from a sustained interaction between challenging content and the application of content and its uses. It requires curriculum that contains complex problems or sophisticated applications, and it moves learning beyond declarative and procedural to conditional conceptual. I'm going to explain those terms in 1 second. But what it really says is if we don't have students engage more deeply with what they're learning, they're just not likely to organize it in their minds. They're not likely to retain it. they're not likely to be able then to do things with it, which is the goal that we have. So what do we mean by declarative, procedural, conditional, and conceptual? You can see declarative and procedural are kind of the gathering of information, and the conditional and conceptual then are the uses of it. So let's look at this in just a little bit more detail. So declarative knowledge, the what, is knowing that something is the case, knowing the parts of speech, knowing the dates of the Civil War battles, defining what a whole number is. And we're very familiar with that, and we can do a lot of that in schools. Procedural knowledge then is the how, which is, how do you apply this for different purposes? Diagramming a sentence, identifying an incorrect use of a parts of speech, explaining the progression of Civil War battles, how that affected the war, and using whole numbers to solve a range of problems. We're going to apply information, but we're going to apply it in a fairly routine fashion. We're going to follow rules, procedures to apply that knowledge. So if we say a procedural learner is really follow directions, and keep in mind that most of school-based learning is procedural. We introduce declarative knowledge and then have students apply it procedurally. And there's certainly reasons to do it that, but it shouldn't be all we do. So if we take this, here's another IKEA example here. So if you want to build a house from IKEA, you just get these, and there's like 7,450 of these things, and you take, and there's the example, but you don't want it to look like that. So you take 1,000 of these, and you put them together, and all of these, you put the roof on, and now you got a McMansion here. So, if it were just that simple, that we could follow procedures, but you can't get number 4 by doing the steps that are shown here. And that's part of the problem with having all learning be procedural, is we can't get to the integration, the transfer of knowledge, the problem solving, some of the other skills we want students to have by just having declarative and procedural knowledge. So let's look at conditional knowledge, which is the using what is known in context, write in a grammatically correct fashion, and speak in a grammatically correct fashion. Understand when to use particular parts of speech, decide when military strategies work best under which circumstances, know when whole numbers do not offer the best or even a possible solution. So conditional knowledge, you can see you're getting into making a lot of decisions, a lot of if-then types of statements. It's analytic thinking, for those of you who kind of are familiar with that level of sophistication. And then finally, conceptual knowledge, knowing why and how what is known relates to a larger concept or field of knowledge. Understanding that different languages invest parts of speech with differing importance and meaning. Understanding that combat in the Civil War rewrote or redefined many of the principles of warfare prevalent at the time. And understand the concept of whole numbers, of number systems, and how whole numbers and fractions are similar and different. There's a conceptual understanding that goes with this, and we could give examples of that, and how that conceptual understanding really solidifies learning. Understanding that teaching fractions by using pizzas and pies is the wrong way to do it, and that a number line is the right way to do it, requires a conceptual understanding of fractions at a deeper level. We want our students to move from being novices to experts, and I've volunteered 2 of my children here. And in the upper right-hand corner is my middle kid when she got her, this is at the DMV, this is her passing her driver's test, and this is my younger kid out to drive. But if we want a really good example of novice versus expert, how many of you have ever taught anyone to drive? And what's it like to drive with a novice driver? And how's that different from driving with an expert driver? Just sort of envision that in your mind. Here are the kind of things novices do. Is they tend to focus on discrete knowledge in isolation. They reason in specific contexts by using recently acquired information. They know individual facts about topics, are slower, more deliberate, learn about pieces of the system, recall information by rote. But experts, faster, more accurate, connect new and prior knowledge, generalize knowledge to new settings, create mental cues, learn through example and analogy, integrate bits into a whole, organize facts into chunks, and use analytic skills to apply knowledge. So if we use our driving example, novice drivers basically can't deal with anything that isn't within their instructional framework and isn't a procedure that they can follow. So when I used to have my kids merge onto the freeway at the Cloverleaf where traffic was also getting off the highway, we had moved out of the procedural domain and into the conditional domain where you have to make decisions on the spot. It was hair-raising, but anyway. So what we want is for students to move from being novice learners and thinkers to being strategic thinkers. This is what will equip them for college, this is what will equip them for the workplace, and this is what will equip them for life. And unfortunately, what we're doing here is largely introducing new material, but we're still treating the learners as novices. We're still structuring the material so highly that the students can't really engage and take control of the learning process. They're not expected to become expert learners, they're just expected to become really good at following directions, and which keeps them at that novice level. Okay, so actions to consider. think about defining college and career readiness as more than a cut score on a test. It's a real temptation to have that be the definition, and it does work for certain state-level purposes, but we need more sophistication than that. Identify the full range of competencies associated with college and career readiness. The Common Core state standards are absolutely necessary, but my point is they're not fully sufficient. There's more than the Common Core to college and career readiness. Use multiple measures to assess readiness. We've got to be looking at new measures beyond having what right now we're getting at content knowledge from 4 or 5 different ways. We have overlapping and redundant measures of content knowledge. What we need to do is look at some other aspects. And lots of good research and good work going on in these areas. Just can't use them for high-stakes purposes. We need to be ready to start piloting some assessments of deeper learning and using things like performance tasks in classrooms to a greater degree. We need to generate more actionable information, and not just status information. A lot of the information we get really tells us where kids stand, but they don't tell students what to do next to improve. And I could give you a lot of examples of that. Students, we need to get them exploring their interests earlier. I mentioned that previously. But there's a lot of ways to do this without tracking students into particular careers because they're going to bounce around too much. But we can give more assignments that require research, that require investigation of careers. ONET has a great online resource for looking at job options and career options and seeing not just the money, but the skills that are involved in it, and getting students to think about the skill sets they need. All that really important to do. And I throw this in here without, I haven't talked about it too much, but we need to deal with the disaster that is the senior year. We are not going to have success unless the students stay fully engaged. And it doesn't just, maybe it's taking academic courses, but it's also exploring what it means to be college and career ready throughout that senior year. Finally, bringing higher education to the table as a full partner. This is a difficult thing to do. Progress is being made, but we're not fully there yet. This is a nation where we purposely kept higher ed and K-12 apart as systems for a very, very long time, and getting over that is going to take some time. We have to align our programs better between high school and college and have more college-like experiences in high school for students, and enhance communication between post-secondary and secondary faculty to share their expectations about what adequate performance is. So a lot of this goes beyond just creating policy frameworks. It's actual interactions on the ground between people at the local level. So my closing point, I just wanted to mention there's a project sponsored by the Council of Chief State School Officers, the Innovation Lab Network. You can see the goals there. It's a generation of learning, moving assessments to a model, to a system of assessments notion, and then exchanging learning and work on learning progressions and other strategies to improve student mastery. You can see the partner states: California, Iowa, Kentucky, Maine, New Hampshire, New York, Ohio, Oregon, West Virginia, Wisconsin. And it's working with EPIC along with Linda Darling-Hammond and Center at Stanford and Reed Pichon Center. So if you're interested in that, you can check with CCSSO. I can also tell you about it. But a lot of what I'm talking about here, that this group is working on. So I wanted to give you one example of people who are trying to move this into practice. Well, I said this was going to go a little bit quickly. It did. We're going to have we'll post the presentation at that website if you decide you'd like to download it. My goal here was really to get you thinking about some things, and hopefully as you participate in the conference for the next day or two, you will have the opportunity to go deeper and understand some of these things a little bit better and share with one another. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here.